The Key of Solomon stands as one of the most enigmatic and influential texts in Western esoteric tradition. For centuries, this grimoire has been shrouded in mystery, attributed to the legendary King Solomon himself, a figure known not only for his wisdom but also for his alleged command over spirits and demons. But what if everything we thought we knew about this text was merely a veil concealing far more ancient truths? What if the rituals contained within these pages were not innovations of medieval magicians, but carefully preserved remnants of pagan practices that predate Judaism and Christianity by millennia? The conventional narrative tells us that the Key of Solomon emerged during the medieval period, somewhere between the 14th and 15th centuries, as Christian Europe became fascinated with ceremonial magic. Scholars have long categorized it as a product of the Renaissance occult revival, a time when educated elites sought to reconcile classical philosophy, Christian theology, and mystical practices. However, this explanation barely scratches the surface of a far deeper and more complex reality. When we examine the Key of Solomon with fresh eyes, patterns emerge that suggest a much older origin. The text itself claims to be the work of King Solomon, who lived approximately 3,000 years ago during the 10th century BC, while mainstream academics dismiss this attribution as a common practice in ancient texts seeking authority through association with revered figures. They may be overlooking crucial evidence hidden in plain sight. The rituals described in the Key of Solomon display remarkable similarities to practices documented in ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite religious traditions. These parallels are not superficial borrowings, but fundamental structural elements that suggest direct lineage or preservation of ancient pagan knowledge. Consider the elaborate preparation rituals, the use of specific planetary hours, the construction of sacred circles, the invocation of entities associated with natural forces, and the employment of ritual tools consecrated through complex ceremonies. All of these elements have clear precedence in pre-Abrahamic religious systems. One of the most striking aspects of the Key of Solomon is its practical approach to spirit work. Unlike later Christian demonology, which portrayed demons as purely evil entities to be exorcised or avoided, the Key of Solomon presents a more nuanced understanding. The spirits invoked through its rituals are understood as powerful but morally neutral forces that can be compelled into service through proper knowledge and technique. This perspective aligns far more closely with ancient pagan worldviews than with Christian theology. In ancient Mesopotamian religion, for example, priests regularly performed rituals to compel various spirits and deities to act on behalf of humans. The Babylonian and Assyrian magical texts are filled with incantations that bear remarkable resemblance to those found in the Key of Solomon. Both traditions emphasize the importance of knowing the true names of spirits, understanding their hierarchies and relationships, and employing specific ritual procedures to ensure successful communication and command. The Egyptian magical tradition similarly demonstrates striking parallels. Ancient Egyptian priests were masters of what they call hek, a form of sacred magic that involved the manipulation of cosmic forces through ritual action and sacred words. The Book of the Dead and other Egyptian magical papyri contain elaborate instructions for ritual purification, the creation of protective amulets, and the invocation of divine powers. These practices required extensive knowledge of correspondences between earthly materials and cosmic forces, precise timing based on astronomical observations, and the correct pronunciation of names of power. Even more intriguing are the connections to Canaanite and earlier Semitic religious practices. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that the ancient inhabitants of the Levant, the very region where Solomon would have ruled, practiced complex forms of ritual magic involving spirit invocation, sacrifice, and the use of sacred objects. The Ugaritic texts, discovered in modern-day Syria, provide evidence of sophisticated religious and magical systems that predate the Israelite monarchy by centuries. King Solomon himself, according to biblical and extra-biblical traditions, was not the strict monotheist that later religious authorities portrayed. The biblical text itself acknowledges that Solomon built temples to foreign gods to please his many foreign wives. This detail, often glossed over or explained away, actually provides crucial context for understanding how Solomon might have acquired and preserved magical knowledge from various pagan traditions. The biblical narrative portrays Solomon as extraordinarily wise and knowledgeable about the natural world. He is said to have had understanding of plants, animals, and the secrets of creation. In ancient Near Eastern contexts, such knowledge was inseparable from religious and magical practice. A king with Solomon's attributed wisdom would necessarily have been versed in the magical arts as they were understood and practiced throughout the ancient world. Furthermore, Ancient Jewish mystical traditions preserve legends about Solomon that differ significantly from the sanitized biblical account. The Testament of Solomon, a text likely composed between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, but possibly preserving much older oral traditions, describes in detail how Solomon compelled demons to build his temple. This text provides elaborate information about demon hierarchies, their powers, and the methods used to control them. While later than the biblical period, the Testament may preserve authentic memories of pre-exilic magical practices. The Talmud and other rabbinic literature also contain references to Solomon's magical abilities and his ring, through which he commanded spirits. While rabbinical authorities often expressed ambivalence about these traditions, they nonetheless preserved them, suggesting that they were too well established in Jewish lore to be completely suppressed. This persistence across centuries indicates that something authentic underlies the legends, even if the details became embellished over time. When Christianity emerged and eventually dominated Europe, pagan magical practices did not simply disappear. Instead, they went underground or were transformed and disguised in ways that made them acceptable or at least tolerable to Christian authorities. The grimoire tradition, of which the Key of Solomon is perhaps the most prominent example, represents one such transformation. By attributing magical knowledge to Solomon, a biblical figure of unquestionable authority, practitioners could justify their practices as recovery of ancient, divinely sanctioned wisdom rather than forbidden paganism. The Key of Solomon thus functions as a kind of time capsule, preserving pagan magical techniques within a framework that appeared acceptable to medieval and Renaissance Christian society. The text carefully cloaks its pagan elements in biblical language and symbolism. Invocations reference Hebrew names of God and angels, creating a veneer of Judeo-Christian orthodoxy. However, beneath this surface layer, the actual procedures and the underlying worldview remain fundamentally pagan in character. Consider the text's approach to ritual timing. The Key of Solomon places enormous emphasis on performing rituals during specific planetary hours and days. This astrological framework derives directly from Babylonian astronomy and astrology, which was integrated into Hellenistic magical practice and eventually preserved in grimoire. The 7 planetary powers invoked in the text correspond to ancient Mesopotamian deities: the sun god, the moon god sign Nabu for Mercury, Ishtar for Venus, Nergal for Mars, Marduk for Jupiter, and Anurda for Saturn. The ritual tools prescribed in the Key of Solomon also reveal pagan origins. The magical sword, the wand, the cup, and the pentacle each have clear antecedents in ancient religious and magical practice. These were not arbitrary inventions of medieval magicians, but rather preservation of ritual implements used for millennia in various pagan traditions. Each tool embodies specific powers and cosmic principles, and their proper creation and consecration follows procedures that can be traced back through multiple ancient cultures. The pentacle itself, prominently featured in the Key of Solomon, has been found in archaeological contexts dating back thousands of years before the medieval period. 5-pointed stars appear in ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian iconography, often associated with goddesses or with the planet Venuses. The of ancient Greece also revered the pentagram as a symbol of mathematical perfection and cosmic harmony. Its inclusion in the Key of Solomon represents continuity with these ancient traditions. The ritual structure presented in the Key of Solomon follows a pattern that appears throughout ancient pagan magical traditions. Understanding this pattern reveals how deeply rooted these practices are in pre-Abrahamic religious systems. The grimoire does not present innovation, but rather codification and preservation of techniques refined over thousands of years across multiple civilizations. Every ritual in the Key of Solomon begins with extensive purification procedures. The magician must undergo physical cleansing through bathing, abstinence from certain foods, and sexual continence for specified periods. These requirements mirror precisely the purification rituals required of priests in ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, and Roman temple service. In these ancient contexts, interaction with divine or spiritual powers required the practitioner to be in a state of ritual purity, separating themselves temporarily from the profane world to enter sacred space. Ancient Egyptian priests underwent elaborate purification before entering temple precincts or performing sacred rites. They shaved their entire bodies, bathed multiple times daily in sacred pools, wore only linen garments, and abstained from certain foods considered impure. These practices were not merely symbolic, but were understood as necessary transformations that made the priest capable of safely interacting with divine forces. The Key of Solomon preserves this same understanding, though the specific details may differ slightly. In Mesopotamian temple practice, priests similarly underwent purification rituals before approaching the gods. Cuneiform tablets describe washing rituals, fumigation with specific incenses, and the donning of ritually clean garments. The Babylonian priest had to be free from physical defects and ritual contamination to serve as an effective intermediary between human and divine realms. This concept of the priest as a purified vessel through which power could flow appears throughout the Key of Solomon. The Greek mystery religions also emphasized purification as prerequisite for initiation and ritual participation. The Eleusinian mysteries, Orphic rites, and Dionysian ceremonies all required participants to undergo cleansing procedures before they could encounter the divine. These purifications often included fasting, bathing in specific waters, and periods of sexual abstinence. The underlying principle was that encountering spiritual power in an impure state was dangerous, both to the practitioner and to the efficacy of the ritual. Roman religious practice continued these traditions. Before offering sacrifice or performing augury, Roman priests observed strict purity requirements. The Vestal virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, maintained perpetual purity as part of their sacred duties. The Pontifex Maximus and other religious officials followed detailed purity codes when performing state rituals. These practices were not unique to Rome, but represented continuation of a pan-Mediterranean understanding of the relationship between purity and sacred power. The Key of Solomon incorporates all these elements into its preparatory procedures. Before attempting to invoke spirits, the practitioner must separate themselves from ordinary life, purify their body and mind, and create a liminal state between the mundane and spiritual worlds. This is not Christian practice, but preservation of pagan ritual technology that predates Christianity by millennia. Following purification, the Key of Solomon requires the creation of a sacred circle within which the magician will perform the ritual. This circle serves as protective boundary and sacred space simultaneously. The concept of the magical circle has clear precedence in ancient pagan practice. Archaeological evidence reveals that various ancient cultures used circular boundaries in their religious and magical rites. In ancient Mesopotamian exorcism rituals, practitioners drew circles of flour or other materials around the afflicted person or sacred space. These circles were understood as boundaries that malevolent spirits could not cross. Incantations were recited while creating the circle, imbuing it with protective power. The circle transformed ordinary space into sacred precinct where the priest could safely perform rituals that might otherwise attract dangerous spiritual attention. Celtic and Germanic peoples also used circular sacred spaces in their religious practices. Stone circles throughout Britain and Northern Europe testify to the importance of circular boundaries in pre-Christian European religion. These circles marked off sacred ground where rituals, sacrifices, and communications with the divine could occur. The circle represented the cosmos in miniature, a perfect form that reflected celestial order and provided protection through its geometric perfection. Greek and Roman magic similarly employed circles in various rituals. The Greek magical papyri, a collection of spells and rituals from Greco-Roman Egypt, frequently mentioned drawing circles as part of invocation procedures. These circles were often inscribed with names of power, symbols, and characters that enhanced their protective and empowering properties. The magician stood within the circle as a sacred space separated from the ordinary world and protected from hostile forces that might be attracted by the ritual. The Key of Solomon elaborates on these ancient practices, providing detailed instructions for constructing the magical circle. The circle must be drawn at specific times, using specific materials, and inscribed with names and symbols that empower it. These names are typically presented as Hebrew divine names or angelic names, but their function is identical to the names of power used in ancient pagan magical circles. The names create a vibration or resonance that establishes the circle as a threshold space between worlds. Within and around the circle, the Key of Solomon specifies the use of various symbols, particularly pentagrams and hexagrams. These geometric forms carry power in themselves, according to the text, and serve to focus and direct spiritual forces. This understanding of sacred geometry as a channel for power is profoundly ancient. Pythagoras and his followers in ancient Greece developed elaborate theories about the mystical properties of numbers and geometric forms. They believed that geometric patterns reflected the fundamental structure of reality and that understanding these patterns provided access to cosmic power. The pentagram, as mentioned earlier, appears throughout ancient iconography, In Babylonian tradition, the five-pointed star was associated with the goddess Ishtar and represented the planet Venus. The Sumerians used it as an ideogram representing cosmic order. Greek Pythagoreans adopted it as their secret symbol, seeing in its proportions the golden ratio and mathematical perfection. The Key of Solomon preserves this ancient reverence for the pentagram, though it reinterprets the symbol within a framework that appears more acceptable to medieval Christian culture. The hexagram, or six-pointed star, often called the Seal of Solomon, similarly has pre-biblical origins. Six-pointed stars appear in ancient Hindu temples, in Islamic architecture, and in various Near Eastern contexts predating the common association with Judaism. The figure is formed by two interlocking triangles, representing the union of opposites masculine and feminine, fire and water, heaven and earth. This symbolism of balanced opposites uniting to create power is fundamental to many ancient religious and philosophical systems. After establishing the protected sacred space, the Key of Solomon proceeds to the invocation of spirits. The invocation formulas presented in the text bear remarkable similarity to ancient pagan invocation practices. In structure, they typically follow a pattern, naming the spirit, declaring the authority by which the magician commands, stating the purpose of the invocation, and compelling obedience through use of names of power. This pattern appears throughout ancient magical literature. The Greek magical papyri use virtually identical structures in their invocation formulas. The magician identifies a spirit or deity being invoked, often by multiple names, to ensure correct identification. The magician then asserts their right to command, often by claiming identity with a god or by invoking higher powers that the spirit must obey. Finally, the magician states their desire and compels the spirit to fulfill it through repeated use of powerful names and threatening consequences for disobedience. Ancient Egyptian magic employed similar techniques. Magicians invoke gods and spirits by reciting their names and epithets, often claiming to be the god Horus or another powerful deity to establish authority. Egyptian spells frequently contained threats against spirits who refused to obey, invoking the power of greater gods who would punish disobedience. The fundamental assumption was that the cosmos operated according to hierarchical principles, and one who knew the correct procedures could manipulate this hierarchy. Mesopotamian incantations likewise follow this pattern. The priest invokes gods by their names and titles, recounts mythological narratives that establish the god's power over the situation, and commands the desired outcome. Often these incantations invoke multiple deities, creating a web of divine power that ensures the ritual success. The Key of Solomon preserves this technique, invoking not only the spirit being summoned but also higher divine names or God himself to ensure obedience. The spirits described in the Key of Solomon are presented within a Christian demonological framework, but their characteristics often reveal pagan origins. Many of the spirits have clear connections to ancient gods and nature spirits that were reinterpreted as demons by Christian theology. The process by which pagan deities became demons is well documented in religious history. As Christianity spread, the gods of older religions were not denied existence, but were reconceptualized as evil spirits or demons. The Roman god Mercury became the demon Mercurius in some grimoire traditions. The Greek god Pan, with his goat legs and horns, contributed to the Christian image of the devil. Numerous local deities throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa were transformed into demons, devils, or evil spirits as Christianity's displaced older religions. The Key of Solomon participates in this transformation, but also preserves information about these entities that reflects their original divine or spiritual nature. Many spirits in the Key of Solomon are associated with specific natural phenomena, particular skills or knowledge, or certain aspects of human experience. This specialization reflects the ancient understanding of nature and cosmos as populated by numerous distinct spiritual powers, each governing particular domains. This is fundamentally a polytheistic or animistic worldview, even when presented within monotheistic language. The Key of Solomon dedicates substantial attention to the creation and consecration of magical tools. These implements are not mere props, but are understood as essential technology for working with spiritual forces. Each tool embodies specific powers and serves particular functions within the ritual system. The detailed instructions for creating these tools reveal their origins in ancient religious and magical practice spanning multiple civilizations. The magical sword holds primary importance among Solomonic tools. The grimoire provides elaborate instructions for its creation, including the timing of its forging, the materials to be used, and the consecration rituals that activate its power. The sword functions as an instrument of command and authority, used to compel spirits to obedience and to trace protective boundaries. This ritual use of swords has clear precedence in ancient practice. In ancient Roman religion, sacred swords played important roles in various ceremonies. The flamen, or priest, would use a special knife to perform sacrifices. The Vestal Virgins used ritual knives in their sacred duties. These blades were not ordinary weapons, but consecrated objects that had undergone purification and dedication rituals. Similarly, Celtic Druids employed sacred sickles for cutting mistletoe and other ritual purposes. These implements had to be made according to specific procedures and consecrated through ceremony to be effective. The ancient Egyptians also recognized the power of ritual blades. Archaeological evidence reveals ceremonial knives and daggers used in temple ceremonies and magical rites. The opening of the mouth ceremony, a crucial funerary ritual, employed special ritual instruments to animate the deceased and enable them to function in the afterlife. These tools were carefully crafted and treated with great reverence as channels of transformative power. Greek mystery religions incorporated sacred knives in their initiation ceremonies. The sacrifice of animals according to precise ritual protocols required blades that had been properly prepared and consecrated. The weapon became an extension of the priest's will and a conduit for divine power. This understanding of ritual tools as more than simple objects but as empowered extensions of the practitioner appears throughout ancient magical practice and is preserved intact in the Key of Solomon. The wand represents another crucial Solomonic tool with deep pagan roots. The Key of Solomon specifies that the wand must be cut from particular types of wood at specific times using specific procedures. Often the wood must come from a tree that has never borne fruit, must be cut at sunrise on a Wednesday or Sunday during certain lunar phases, and must be consecrated through elaborate rituals involving fumigation, anointing, and invocation. The use of magical wands extends back into prehistory. Ancient Egyptian priests carried scepters, staffs that symbolized power and authority. These were not merely symbols, but were understood as instruments through which divine power flowed. Pharaohs held the crook and flail as insignia of their divine kingship and magical authority. Temple reliefs show priests using wands to perform rituals and channel energy. Greek magicians employed wands in their practices, as attested in the magical papyrus. Hermes, the god associated with magic, is regularly depicted carrying his caduceus, a wand entwined with serpents. This wand gave Hermes power to guide souls between worlds and to work transformative magic. Human magicians who invoked Hermes or worked in his tradition often employed wands as their primary implement. Celtic and Germanic magical traditions also feature prominent use of wands and staffs. The term druid itself may derive from roots, meaning oak, knowledge, and druids were closely associated with sacred groves and wooden implements. Northsider practitioners used staffs in their magical workings, believing these implements helped channel and direct mystical forces. The fairy wand of later European folklore preserves memory of these ancient practices. The Key of Solomon preserves this pan-cultural reverence for the wand as a tool of power by specifying the exact procedures for creating and consecrating the wand. The grimoire transmits practical knowledge developed and refined over thousands of years. The wand serves to focus the magician's will, to invoke and command spirits, and to direct energy according to intention. The cup or chalice appears in the Key of Solomon as another essential implement, used for holding consecrated water or wine, for scrying, or for offerings. The cup represents the receptive principle in magical work. Just as the sword and wand project active force, the cup receives and contains spiritual influences. This understanding of complementary active and receptive principles operating in magic reflects ancient philosophical concepts about the nature of reality. In ancient religious practice, sacred cups and vessels played crucial roles. The Greek symposium involved ritual use of the kylex, a wide, shallow cup used for wine. Drinking from this vessel in religious context established communion between participants and the gods. The crater, a large mixing bowl, was used to combine wine and water in proportions considered appropriate for different occasions. These vessels were often decorated with religious imagery and treated with reverence. Egyptian temples employed numerous sacred vessels in daily rituals. Priests used special containers for lustral water, for libations, and for offerings to the gods. These vessels were crafted according to specific requirements and consecrated for sacred use. They could not be employed for profane purposes once dedicated to the gods. The vessels were understood as containers not just of physical substances but of spiritual potencies. Celtic traditions prominently featured sacred cauldrons. The Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in Denmark, and dated to the 1st century BC, shows elaborate religious scenes and may have been used in ritual contexts. Irish mythology speaks of the cauldron of the Dagda, which could feed any number of people, and the cauldron of rebirth, which could restore the dead to life. These mythological cauldrons reflect actual ritual use of vessels in Celtic religious practice. The Holy Grail legends of medieval Christianity preserve and transform these pagan traditions about sacred cups. The Grail, allegedly the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, possesses miraculous powers of healing and sustenance. While given Christian interpretation, the Grail clearly inherits characteristics of earlier pagan sacred vessels. The Key of Solomon's emphasis on the ritual cup participates in this long tradition of vessel-centered magical practice. The pentacle, often confused with the pentagram, is in the Key of Solomon a disc or plate inscribed with magical symbols. The grimoire provides designs for numerous pentacles, each serving specific purposes such as protection, invisibility, commanding spirits, obtaining visions, or achieving various practical goals. These pentacles must be created from specific materials: virgin parchment, pure metal, or other substances, and consecrated through elaborate rituals. The use of inscribed talismans and amulets is among the most ancient of magical practices. Archaeological discoveries have revealed countless examples of talismanic objects from virtually every ancient civilization. These objects were inscribed with divine names, magical characters, sacred symbols, or images of gods and spirits. They were believed to embody the powers they represented and to convey those powers to their possessor. Babylonian and Assyrian cylinder seals often served talismanic functions. While used practically to seal documents, these carved stone cylinders also bore images of gods and protective spirits. Wearing such a seal provided the owner with divine protection and favor. Numerous clay and stone amulets from Mesopotamia feature incantations and images designed to ward off demons, cure diseases, or attract beneficial influences. Ancient Egypt produced an extraordinary variety of amulets and talismans. The Ankh symbol representing life, the wedged eye of Horus for protection and healing, the scarab beetle for transformation and renewal. These and countless other amulets were worn by the living and placed with the dead. Each symbol concentrated specific powers and conveyed them to the wearer. Elaborate rituals of consecration activated these talismans and connected them to the divine powers they represented. Greek and Roman amulets similarly employed inscribed characters, divine names, and symbolic images. The Greek magical papyri provide detailed instructions for creating various talismans for love, protection, victory, binding enemies, and numerous other purposes. These instructions specify materials, timing, and consecration procedures, remarkably similar to those found in the Key of Solomon. The continuity of practice across centuries is unmistakable. Jewish magical practice developed its own rich tradition of amulets and talismans, drawing on both biblical texts and surrounding cultural influences. Names of God, biblical verses, and angelic names were inscribed on parchment or metal and worn for protection. The mezuzah, a case containing scriptural verses affixed to doorposts, functions as a permanent protective talisman. Jewish mystical traditions elaborated complex systems of divine names and their uses, systems that influenced the development of grimoire magic. The pentacles of the Key of Solomon synthesize these various traditions. They employ Hebrew divine names and angelic names, demonstrating Jewish mystical influence. They feature geometric patterns reflecting Pythagorean and Platonic sacred geometry. They incorporate astrological symbols showing Babylonian and Hellenistic influence. They are created and consecrated using procedures derived from ancient Egyptian and Greek magical practice. The pentacles thus represent a convergence point where multiple ancient streams of magical knowledge come together. Beyond the four primary tools, sword, wand, cup, and pentacle, the Key of Solomon describes numerous other implements. The atham, a black-handled knife, distinct from the sword, is used for carving symbols and inscriptions. The burin or stylus inscribes characters on metal or wax. The censer holds incense for fumigation. The lamp provides ritual illumination. Special vestments must be sewn and consecrated. A book or grimoire records the magician's knowledge and operations. Each of these items has precedence in ancient religious practice. Priests in virtually all ancient religions wore special garments when performing sacred duties. These vestments separated the priest from ordinary life and marked them as intermediaries between human and divine realms. The garments had to be made from specific materials, often linen or wool, and could not be contaminated by contact with profane things. Incense use is nearly universal in ancient religion. Egyptians burned kifi and other special blends in temple ceremonies. Babylonian priests offered incense to the gods in elaborate rituals. Greek and Roman temples were filled with fragrant smoke from sacrifices and incense offerings. Jewish temple service centered on the altar of incense, where specific blends were burned according to biblical prescription. The key of Solomon's emphasis on fumigation with specific incenses at specific times continues this ancient practice. The magical book itself represents a crucial tool in the Solomonic tradition. The grimoire serves as a record of knowledge, guide for practice, and talismanic object in its own right. The magician must hand-copy rituals, pentacle designs, invocations, and observations into a personal book. This book becomes charged with power through use and must be carefully protected. The concept of sacred texts as objects of power, not merely sources of information, is ancient. The Key of Solomon presents an elaborate hierarchy of spirits that the magician can invoke for various purposes. These entities are described with specific names, ranks, powers, and characteristics, while the grimoire presents them within a framework of biblical angels and fallen spirits. Careful examination reveals that many of these beings are actually ancient pagan deities who underwent transformation as religious paradigms shifted. Understanding this transformation illuminates one of the most significant processes in religious history: how the gods of older traditions became the demons of newer ones. The demonization of pagan gods began as monotheistic religions expanded into territories where polytheistic traditions had flourished for millennia. Rather than denying the existence of these gods, monotheistic theology reinterpreted them. The beings that had been worshipped as beneficent deities were reconceptualized as rebellious spirits, fallen angels, or demons who sought to deceive humanity. This strategy served multiple purposes to explain the persistence of older religious experiences while delegitimizing the worship of these entities. In the ancient world, spiritual beings were understood as morally ambiguous forces. Gods could be helpful or harmful depending on circumstances and how they were approached. They demanded respect and proper ritual treatment, but were not inherently evil. This nuanced understanding persisted in folk practice even after official conversion to Christianity. The grimoire tradition, including the Key of Solomon, preserves this older understanding beneath its surface theology. The spirits can be commanded to perform useful services. They possess knowledge and powers that benefit the magician. The planetary spirits represent perhaps the clearest example of pagan gods preserved in Solomonic magic. The Key of Solomon organizes much of its ritual practice around the 7 classical planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each planet is associated with specific spirits, powers, and ritual procedures. This planetary framework derives directly from ancient Babylonian religion and astronomy. In Babylonian cosmology, the planets were not merely celestial bodies, but were divine beings themselves, or were intimately associated with specific gods. Shamash, the sun god, Sin, the moon god, Nabu associated with Mercury, Ishtar with Venus, Nergal with Mars, Marduk with Jupiter, and Enurda with Saturn. These deities governed both celestial phenomena and earthly affairs. Babylonian priest astronomers developed sophisticated observational techniques and mathematical models to track planetary movements, understanding these movements as expressions of divine will. This Babylonian planetary theology spread throughout the ancient world. Greek culture adopted it, identifying the Babylonian gods with their own deities: Helios with the sun, Selene with the moon, Hermes with Mercury, Aphrodite with Venus, Artes with Mars, Zeus with Jupiter, and Kronos with Saturn. Roman culture continued the synthesis, using their own divine names: Luna, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Medieval and Renaissance magic inherited this entire complex system. The Key of Solomon's planetary magic thus represents direct continuity with ancient pagan astral religion. When the magician performs rituals during the hour of Mars, invoking spirits associated with that planet to gain courage or victory in conflict, they are essentially practicing a modernized form of the ancient cult of Nergal, or Ares. The names may have changed, filtered through Hebrew and Latin, but the underlying practice remains fundamentally pagan. Beyond the planetary spirits, the Key of Solomon describes numerous other entities with specialized powers and domains. Some of these can be directly traced to specific pagan deities. Astaroth, one of the prominent spirits in Solomonic and later Goetic tradition, clearly derives from Astarte or Astareth, the ancient Canaanite and Phoenician goddess of love, war, and fertility. Astarte was widely worshipped throughout the ancient Near East and was one of the deities whose cult Solomon himself supported according to biblical accounts. The transformation of Astarte into the demon Astaroth demonstrates the demonization process. The goddess who was once invoked for blessings, protection, and prosperity became reinterpreted as a deceptive spirit who must be commanded and controlled. However, the powers attributed to Astaroth in grimoire tradition often reflect the ancient attributes of Astarte. The demon provides knowledge, answers questions, and can make the magician powerful abilities that would have been sought from the goddess in her original cultic context. Bol, another prominent name in Solomonic magic appearing as Baal, directly references the Canaanite storm and fertility god who was one of the principal deities of the ancient Levant. The biblical texts frequently condemn the worship of Baal, indicating how widespread and persistent his cult was among the populations of ancient Israel and Judah. By the time the grimoire tradition developed, Baal had been fully transformed into a demon, yet retained associations with power and kingship that reflect his original divine status. Belial represents another clear example of this transformation. In ancient Canaanite texts, Belial appears as a destructive force or perhaps a deity of the underworld. In biblical Hebrew texts, the term came to mean worthlessness or wickedness, but likely preserved memory of an actual deity. By the Hellenistic period, Belial had become personified as a chief demon or Satan figure in Jewish apocalyptic literature. The grimoire tradition fully develops Belial as a powerful king of hell, yet one whose powers can be harnessed by the knowledgeable magician. The process continues with countless other spirits. Moloch, the ancient deity to whom children were allegedly sacrificed, becomes a demon. Dagon, the Philistine fish god, transforms into an infernal power. Mammon, originally simply the Aramaic word for wealth, becomes personified as the demon of greed. Each transformation represents a layer of religious and cultural change, but each also preserves memory of older religious realities. The Key of Solomon's approach to these spirits reveals sophisticated understanding of spiritual cosmology that transcends simple good versus evil dichotomies. The spirits possess specific domains of knowledge and power. Some govern natural phenomena, some influence human affairs, some provide access to hidden information. The magician's task is to identify which spirit possesses the power needed for a particular purpose, and to correctly invoke and command that spirit using proper procedures. This functional approach to spirit work aligns perfectly with ancient pagan practice. In polytheistic systems, different gods had different specializations. One would not approach Athena for matters of love or Aphrodite for matters of wisdom. Each deity had their sphere of influence, and effective religious practice required knowing which deity to petition for which purpose. The Key of Solomon preserves this polytheistic logic structure even while superficially presenting a monotheistic framework. The hierarchical organization of spirits in Solomonic magic also reflects ancient precedents. Ancient Near Eastern religions recognize hierarchies among divine beings. In Babylonian theology, Marduk rose to supremacy over other gods. In Canaanite religion, El was father of the gods, with various deities ranked beneath him. Greek and Roman pantheons had clearer hierarchical structures, with Zeus or Jupiter at the apex. The Key of Solomon's ranking of spirits as kings, dukes, princes, marquises, presidents, and earls directly mirrors medieval feudal hierarchy, but conceptually continues the ancient understanding of celestial hierarchy. Jewish mystical tradition developed elaborate angelology that also influenced grimoire magic. The Merkaba mysticism of late antiquity and the later Kabbalistic tradition mapped out complex hierarchies of angels organized into choirs, each with specific functions and rulers. This development occurred in dialogue with both biblical traditions and surrounding cultural influences, including Greek and Gnostic ideas about celestial hierarchy. The Key of Solomon synthesizes these Jewish mystical developments with the older pagan material. The Seal of Solomon, the magical ring through which the legendary king supposedly commanded spirits, itself has complex origins. The hexagram or six-pointed star, now commonly identified as the Seal of Solomon, appears in various ancient contexts not originally connected to Judaism. Islamic tradition also preserves extensive lore about Solomon as master of jinn and spirits, adding another layer to the synthesis. The ring functions in the legend as a divine grant of authority, but conceptually it represents mastery of sacred names and symbols knowledge that was central to ancient magical practice across cultures. The names of power used throughout the Key of Solomon demonstrate this synthesis of traditions. Hebrew names of God Elohim, Adonai, Tetragrammaton are invoked alongside names of angels and by implication the spirits themselves. The magician commands spirits using these divine names, operating on the principle that knowing the true name of a being grants power over it. This concept is profoundly ancient, appearing in Egyptian magic where knowing the secret names of gods granted power, and throughout Mesopotamian magical practice. The invocations in the Key of Solomon frequently combine multiple divine names in long strings, creating complex formulas that are themselves understood as powerful. This practice closely resembles the Voces magical words and strings of vowels that appear throughout the Greek magical papyri. These sound-based magical techniques derive from ancient understandings of language as not merely communicative but as creative and powerful in itself. The Egyptian concept of Heka emphasized the creative power of the spoken word. Hebrew tradition similarly understood divine speech as the mechanism of creation. The grimoire tradition inherits and preserves these ancient linguistic magical technologies. The timing of Solomonic rituals according to planetary hours and astrological considerations further demonstrates the pagan foundation of the practice. Ancient Babylonian priest astronomers developed detailed methods for calculating celestial positions and determining auspicious times for various activities. This astrological timing became central to Hellenistic magic and was transmitted through Arabic sources into medieval European magic. The Key of Solomon's elaborate instructions about performing rituals during specific planetary hours on specific days represents direct inheritance of Babylonian celestial science applied to magical practice. The survival of the Key of Solomon across centuries represents one of the most remarkable examples of underground knowledge transmission in Western history. The grimoire did not emerge suddenly in the medieval period, but rather represents the culmination of a long process by which ancient pagan magical knowledge was preserved, transformed, and passed down through generations despite centuries of religious opposition and persecution. Understanding this transmission process reveals how resilient and adaptable esoteric traditions can be when faced with hostile cultural environments. The Key of Solomon, as we know it today, likely crystallized into written form during the 14th or 15th century Italian Renaissance. However, the text itself claims far greater antiquity, presenting itself as the work of King Solomon transmitted to his son. The legendary history recorded in the grimoire's introduction describes how the book was hidden in Solomon's tomb and later discovered by Babylonian philosophers who could not read it until one of them, Iohe Gravis, received divine assistance. This mythical narrative serves multiple functions beyond simply claiming ancient authority. The story of the book's discovery and transmission encodes important truths about how esoteric knowledge actually passes through time. Knowledge becomes hidden either through deliberate concealment or through cultural disruption. It remains inaccessible to those who lack proper preparation or understanding. It requires divine or spiritual assistance to unlock, meaning that intellectual knowledge alone proves insufficient without experiential. These themes appear consistently throughout esoteric traditions and reflect genuine patterns in how mystery teachings are preserved and transmitted. The manuscript history of the Key of Solomon demonstrates the complex textual transmission. The earliest surviving manuscripts date from the 15th century, including an important Greek text known as the Magical Treatise of Solomon or This Greek text, closely related to the Latin Clavicula Salomonis, provides crucial evidence for the grimoire's development. The existence of early Greek versions suggests transmission through Byzantine magical traditions that themselves preserved ancient Hellenistic and earlier Near Eastern practices. Byzantine culture served as a crucial bridge between ancient and medieval worlds. While Western Europe descended into the early medieval period with significant loss of classical learning, the Byzantine Empire maintained continuity with late Ansi culture. Greek remained the language of learning, and classical texts were copied and preserved. Byzantine scholars also maintained and developed magical traditions rooted in the ancient world. The Magical Treatise of Solomon represents this Byzantine preservation of ancient magical knowledge, which eventually flowed westward as contacts between Byzantine and Western European scholars increased during the late medieval and Renaissance periods. The Italian Renaissance provided ideal conditions for the grimoire tradition to flourish. Renaissance scholars pursued classical learning with unprecedented enthusiasm, recovering ancient texts and attempting to understand pre-Christian philosophy and wisdom. This recovery extended to esoteric and magical texts. Scholars such as Marsilio Ficino translated Hermetic texts and Neoplatonic philosophy, introducing educated Europeans to ancient mystical traditions. Pico della Mirandola argued for the validity of ancient wisdom traditions, including Kabbalah and magic. In this intellectual climate, grimoires like the Key of Solomon could circulate among learned magicians who saw themselves as recovering ancient knowledge rather than inventing new practices. The attribution to Solomon served essential protective and authorizing functions. By claiming biblical origins, the grimoire could deflect charges of paganism or heresy. Solomon's wisdom was unquestioned in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. If Solomon had possessed and practiced this knowledge, then by definition it could not be entirely illegitimate. This strategy of pseudepigraphy, attributing texts to ancient authorities, was common practice in esoteric literature and served to preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been destroyed as pagan or heretical. Jewish mystical traditions played crucial intermediary roles in preserving and transmitting ancient magical knowledge. Jewish communities maintained continuity across cultural transitions that disrupted other populations. Jewish mystical texts like the Sefer Yetzirah and later Kabbalistic works preserved and developed cosmological and magical concepts with roots in ancient Near Eastern religion. The elaborate angelology, use of divine names, and techniques of letter mysticism that appear in Jewish esotericism influenced the development of grimoire magic. The Key of Solomon draws heavily on these Jewish mystical traditions while also incorporating Christian and pagan elements. Islamic culture similarly served as preserver and transmitter of ancient knowledge. As Islamic civilization expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Europe, Muslim scholars encountered and preserved ancient texts. Works of Greek philosophy and science were translated into Arabic and often survived only in these Arabic versions. Islamic magical traditions also developed, incorporating pre-Islamic Arabian practices with influences from Persian, Indian, Greek, and Jewish sources. Islamic legends about Suleiman ibn Daud, the Quranic Solomon, attributed to him mastery over jinn and demons. These Islamic traditions influenced Western grimoire magic through cultural contact in Spain, Sicily, and during the Crusades. The translation of texts from Greek and Arabic into Latin during the medieval period brought ancient magical knowledge into Western European circulation. Translation centers in Spain, particularly Toledo, and in Sicily served as crucial points of cultural exchange where Christian, Jewish, and Islamic scholars collaborated. Medical, astronomical, mathematical, and magical texts were translated, introducing Western European scholars to knowledge that had been preserved in the Islamic world. Many grimoires show clear influence from Arabic magical texts, demonstrating this translation process at work. The printing press revolutionized the transmission of esoteric knowledge. Before printing, grimoires existed only in manuscript form, laboriously hand-copied and circulating in limited numbers among small communities of practitioners. The advent of printing in the 5th-10th century made mass production of texts possible for the first time. Magical texts were among the early books printed despite church opposition. Protestant regions proved more hospitable to grimoire printing than Catholic areas, where the Inquisition maintained stricter control. Printed grimoires reached far wider audiences than manuscript versions ever could, democratizing access to magical knowledge. This democratization had profound effects. Magical knowledge that had been restricted to educated elites became accessible to broader populations. Folk magical practitioners who could read or who knew someone who could read now had access to elaborate ceremonial magic traditions. This led to creative synthesis as learned magic merged with folk practices. It also provoked increased concern from religious and secular authorities who saw magical practice as potentially dangerous and certainly heretical. Witch trials and persecution of magical practitioners intensified during the early modern period, partially in response to the wider circulation of magical knowledge. Despite persecution, magical traditions persisted and evolved. Practitioners developed strategies for working within or around religious restrictions, emphasizing the Christian elements of grimoire magic, invoking God and angels rather than pagan gods. Using biblical language and symbolism, these adaptations allowed magical practice to continue in Christianized forms. The Key of Solomon exemplifies this adaptive strategy. On its surface, the text is thoroughly biblical and Christian, invoking God for all operations. Beneath the surface, the actual practices preserve pagan techniques and worldviews. The grimoire tradition experienced revival during the 19th century as part of the broader occult Renaissance. Organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 80, drew heavily on grimoire magic, including the Key of Solomon. S.L. McGregor Math, one of the Golden Dawn's founders, published an English translation of the Key of Solomon in 1889, making the text widely accessible in the English-speaking world for the first time. The Golden Dawn synthesized grimoire magic with Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, and other esoteric traditions, creating elaborate ceremonial magic systems that influenced 20th century Western. Modern scholarship has approached grimoires from historical and anthropological perspectives, analyzing them as cultural artifacts that reveal information about the societies that produced and used them. Researchers have traced the complex transmission networks through which magical knowledge traveled across cultures and centuries. They have identified the multiple sources: ancient, Near Eastern, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Jewish, Islamic, Christian, that contributed to the grimoire tradition. This scholarly work has illuminated the Key of Solomon's place within the broader history of magic and religion. Contemporary magical practitioners continue to work with the Key of Solomon and related texts. Some approach the grimoire as a historical system to be reconstructed and practiced as authentically as possible. Others adapt its techniques to contemporary contexts, synthesizing Solomonic methods with other magical traditions. Debates continue within occult communities about the proper interpretation and application of grimoire magic, about the nature of the spirits invoked, and about the relationship between ancient and modern practice. The Key of Solomon thus stands as testament to the remarkable persistence of ancient pagan wisdom. Despite centuries of religious opposition, cultural transformation, and active persecution, the core techniques and understandings preserved in this grimoire have survived. The text functions as a time capsule, carrying forward into the modern world practices and knowledge developed thousands of years ago by ancient civilizations. By understanding the Key of Solomon's pagan foundations, we gain insight not only into the history of magic, but into the broader processes by which cultural knowledge persists, transforms, and adapts across time. The grimoire reveals that religious and cultural boundaries are more permeable than they initially appear. Ideas, practices, and beliefs flow between traditions, are reinterpreted in new contexts, and survive in unexpected forms. The gods of one era become the demons of another, yet retain their essential characteristics and powers. Ritual techniques developed for one religious context are adapted to serve different theological frameworks while maintaining their practical effectiveness. Ancient wisdom persists because it addresses fundamental human needs and experiences that transcend particular cultural expressions. For the modern reader, whether scholar, practitioner, or curious observer, the Key of Solomon offers a unique window into multiple dimensions of human spiritual experience. It preserves ancient magical technology developed through centuries of experimentation and refinement. It demonstrates how esoteric knowledge transmission operates across cultures and time periods. It reveals the complex relationships between different religious traditions that share common roots. Most fundamentally, it testifies to the enduring human drive to understand, access, and work with spiritual forces and dimensions of reality that transcend the ordinary material world. The ancient pagan truth about the Key of Solomon is ultimately this: beneath its medieval Christian surface lies a deep stratum of pre-Abrahamic religious practice, carefully preserved through centuries of cultural change. The grimoire represents not innovation but conservation, not invention but transmission. It stands as monument to the persistence of ancient wisdom and to the ingenuity of those who ensured that wisdom would survive for future generations to rediscover and perhaps to practice once again.